I kindly ask you to take your seats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the wonderful discussion, previous discussion. I promised before to update you on the score of the basketball game between Slovenia and US. I'm just telling you the points US has given, 99, and I'm not telling you how much Slovenia has given. It's 77, so you won. So thank you. Now I would like to introduce Ms. Helga Schmidt, Director of the Policy Unit of the General Secretariat of the Council of the European Union, to take the floor and to moderate this fine panel on EU in a multipolar world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure, my privilege to be the chairwoman of this very prestigious panel, which is a follow-up of the main panel we have had. And let me say, also from a Brussels view, it's a very good moment to be having this debate with the Lisbon Treaty in force, with the European Action Service finally taking shape, Catherine Ashton being appointed as the High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission. And I think it's also good that we have a mix here of Europeans and non-Europeans, because this will be as much about our internal setup as about our relations with others, about our partnerships. I would like to say a couple of words to maybe try to give the framework, the key issues that should guide our discussions. But first of all, allow me to introduce our very prestigious panel. Here I will start from the left with former Prime Minister Felipe González, who does not need much introduction anyway, has been a Prime Minister of his country in a very decisive moment for his country. But recently, he has been the chair of the Reflection Group on the future of Europe. And he has produced a report for the 27 heads of states and government that exactly deals with the issues of our panel. And this is about how the EU might be relevant to the concerns, to the aspirations, to the ambitions of European citizens 20 years from now. Next to him is Jean-Dominique Giuliani, who is the chairman of the board of the Foundation Robert Schuman, a very prestigious French think tank dealing with Europe, studies on Europe, and he himself has written numerous books, articles on Europe, notably on enlargement. Next to him is the Hungarian Foreign Minister, János Mátyonyi, who is not only a very experienced, long-standing politician, but also has a very high-profile academic background, having been a full-time professor and a long-standing political career, foreign minister already 10 years ago, and now again foreign minister of his country. Next to him is our guest from Canada, the Minister of National Defense of Canada, who has a background in law, has worked as a Crown Attorney for the Central Region of Nova Scotia, and before he became Defense Minister, he served as Foreign Affairs Minister and Minister of the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. Next to him is the Foreign Minister of Bulgaria, Nikolai Mladenov, who is as much an expert on foreign and defense as he is on economic issues, and he was also representative to the Constitutional Convention on the Future of Europe, which was actually also dealing with many of the questions we will be discussing today. And last but not least, our guest from China, Ambassador May, who has had a very distinguished diplomatic career. He served as ambassador in my country, Germany, and ever since 2003, he has been the director of the China Foundation for International Studies. With that, allow me maybe just to make a couple of remarks to introduce our discussion today. Europe stands at a critical point in its history. This is what Felipe González says in his report, and we have heard it in the previous panel. The current crisis, its political ramification, transnational threats, some of them, like water, like the energy challenge, will be discussed tomorrow. And if we look at it, the traditional concept of the European Union, the concept which is embodied in our European security strategy has been a belief in effective multilateralism. Multilateralism meaning well-functioning international institutions and the rule-based international order. Now, multipolarity, and this is a term we in the EU did not like very much until very recently, but multipolarity, meaning the existence of several power centers, has become a fact of life. So the strategic question actually for the EU is, and also for this panel is, what will it take for the EU to be a relevant pole, like in 20 years, as Felipe González was examining in his report, and actually how to be an actor capable of defending and promoting its interests. Now, the EU is an anchor of stability. This is fair to say. This is, it is, as Antonio Patriota said in the previous panel, it's a model of inspiration and certainly the most successful model of regional integration and sovereignty sharing. And we've tried to export this model. But sovereignty is still very much kicking and alive elsewhere. And I would say most of the global actors we're dealing with are actually quite suspicious of global governance mechanisms that might impinge on their sovereignty. So the question will be how to balance different perspectives with an imperative for cooperation. And maybe in this panel we could focus more on issues of global security. They're very sensitive issues like the management, active management of state fragility. We have come to talk about sovereign responsibility, a responsible sovereignty lately, the fact that sovereignty entails responsibility. This actually relates to a question that was asked before about human rights. The European Union and US, Canada have a very active tradition of promoting good governance, human rights. It will be interesting to hear the panel here. But of course also the questions related to the financial crisis. We have spoken about the G20 in the previous panel. Here again, the view was that G20 is not representative. It will be interesting to hear the views of our Chinese guest here. Should the EU play a lead in reforming the existing multilateral institutions? Or is the future more the informal groupings? What is it with the BRIC? China will host the next BRIC summit next year. Is that the way forward? And then another question that is more for the EU internally is, I think it was the Belgian Prime Minister who said that the EU is still the biggest economic power, even with 7% of its world population, will generate 22% of the world's wealth. But actually, how can the EU translate the economic cloud that an integrated market of 500 million brings into a more active pursuing of our political objectives? And this brings us back to Lisbon, when Catherine Ashton usually says that Lisbon is about bringing together politics, economics, and security. Now, when we talk about security, we tend to believe in the EU that we have actually become a security provider in the last decade because of the, let's say, very painful experience the EU had in the 90s. We have deployed over 20 missions, mostly of civilian nature, some of them military missions, like recently in Chad, where we were protecting refugees. There's an ongoing naval mission fighting piracy off the coast of Somalia. But still, is this relevant? Is this relevant for countries like Canada? Canada is a partner. Canada has participated in our missions in Bosnia and in Congo, is a very important partner when it comes to crisis management. But is the EU seen as a relevant partner in crisis management? And the last issue would be our partnerships. There is, of course, talking about Canada, there is the transatlantic partnership. The US-Canada, which has traditionally been the closest one, given historic kinship, given shared values. Is this going to stay like that in the future? Somebody mentioned Russia in the previous panel. And indeed, Russia is, we have had a strained relationship with Russia over Georgia. But I would say divorce has never been an option because of the economic interdependence and because of proximity. There is certainly a lot of untapped potential, also, for example, in security on crisis management. I will leave it here. Last word would be, of course, on the internal aspects. Where's the process of European integration now heading following the Lisbon Treaty? And actually, and this is for me one of the most important questions, is how to build support for our foreign policy. Or I should say, not support for our foreign policy, because according to opinion polls, an overriding majority of European citizens believes that only the EU actually can defend Europe's interests externally in an efficient way. But it's about getting support for our capabilities, for our resources, because in order to protect our interests in a more efficient way, we have to be able to develop and commit resources and capabilities. I will stop here. I would invite Prime Minister González maybe to kick off and maybe say a few words on what is your recipe, what was the recipe of the reflection group on the way forward for Europe.
Quería plantear, más que en nombre del grupo de reflexión, en nombre propio, dos cuestiones de carácter general. Partiendo de la base de que la historia de la integración europea es una historia muy exitosa. Piensen que cuando desaparece el bloque comunista, Europa tenía 12 países y ha pasado a 27 países. De ellos, 12, el mismo número que tenía originariamente o en el año 90, 12 procedentes del área comunista con regímenes comunistas. Pero al mismo tiempo que es una historia de éxito desde el punto de vista de la integración, yo creo que Europa ha estado distraída, por decirlo suavemente, respecto de dos fenómenos importantísimos. ¿Cómo cambió la realidad mundial después de la Guerra Fría en materia de seguridad? ¿Y cómo cambió la realidad mundial por la irrupción de la revolución tecnológica, creando nuevas fronteras económicas radicalmente distintas a las anteriores? Te doy la oportunidad. Sí.
Thank you. More than speaking on behalf of the Reflection Group, I will speak on my own behalf. First of all, I'd like to say that there are two main ideas that we have to bear in mind. Obviously, the European Union's history has been a story of success. We have to remember that the EU had 12 countries when the communist bloc came to an end, and now we have 27 member states, 12 of which came from the communist group. But, however, this successful integration, which of course has been a success story, as I said, does not mean that we must leave out two important phenomena. We have to really bear them in mind. One is how the global reality has changed after the Cold War. We have to take that into account, and I think we're not doing it. And the other thing is that how the global reality has changed due to technological advances.
De la primera cuestión, ¿por qué la Unión Europea está soportando más la crisis financiera y económica mundial que cualquier otra región del mundo, incluido Estados Unidos, donde se genera? Puedes darle eso.
Well, the first issue is why the EU is seeing a greater impact of the global financial and economical crisis than the rest of the world, including the United States, which is where the crisis started in the first place.
En mi opinión, la implosión del sistema financiero sobre Europa produce mayor efecto porque las estructuras europeas estaban inadaptadas a la globalización y a la revolución tecnológica.
In my opinion, the collapse of the financial system in the EU was due to the fact that the EU structures were not adapted to globalization and the new technologies.
Por tanto, Europa tendría que tener una respuesta a la crisis que sin duda va a ser un parteaguas de la historia para todos nosotros y una respuesta de medio y largo plazo.
So the EU has to have a response to the crisis because it will be a changing point for all of us and it will have a great impact in the medium and long term.
En cuanto a la crisis, es demasiado pronto para abandonar todas las políticas anticíclicas, como se ha hecho. Hay que intentar aumentar la gobernanza económica para mantener la unión monetaria y hay que intentar acordar con Estados Unidos una reforma del sistema financiero internacional que pueda proponerse al Grupo de los 20.
As for the crisis, it's too early to just impose anti-cyclic policies as what is being done. We have to increase the economic governance in the EU and we have to reach agreements with the US referring to the financial system at a global level, and we have to ensure that the G20 includes all those changes and accepts them.
Y si quiere competir en la economía global, tiene que enfrentar sus problemas estructurales, tanto los demográficos, en contradicción con el rechazo a la inmigración, problemas demográficos insolubles si no se tienen en cuenta los flujos migratorios, cuanto los problemas de capital humano por inadaptación a la economía del conocimiento, cuanto los problemas energéticos por un exceso de dependencia sin políticas energéticas comunes.
So how can we compete in this new global world? We have to take into account that there are different issues. We have to, first of all, solve our structural problems. I'm talking about our demographic problems. There's the issue of immigration, which has to be faced, although sometimes it is not something that we like to hear about, but it's the only way of solving this problem. Human capital, which is not adapted to the current situation, to the knowledge society, and energy issues, which have to be faced also.
Y la segunda gran cuestión es cómo ser relevantes en el nuevo escenario mundial.
And the second issue is how to become relevant on the new global scene.
Lo primero que preocupa es pensar que la Unión Europea, de la que se habla como un espacio público compartido, también se interpreta que juega un papel internacional que todavía no es cierto.
The first concern is that we have to see how the EU, which is a public shared space, actually can play this international role, which is not yet a reality.
Les pondré un ejemplo significativo, aunque no dramático. La Unión Europea tenía la posición común más avanzada en materia de lucha contra el cambio climático. Sin embargo, en Copenhague la Unión Europea no fue tenida en cuenta. Entre otras cosas porque una cosa es tener una posición común y otra una estrategia común para defender la posición.
I'll give you an example, just which is not extremely dramatic, but it is a significant example. The EU had the most advanced common position when it came to the fight against climate change, but in Copenhagen the EU was not taken into account because it's not the same to have a common position as to have a common strategy.
La Unión Europea no tiene una estrategia común en su relación con Rusia y con los países del entorno. No la tiene en su relación con el Mediterráneo. No tiene una estrategia común. Puede tener una posición común, el mínimo denominador común de los países que la integran, pero no tiene una voluntad que se exprese estratégicamente para conseguir objetivos en la política exterior, ni siquiera en la de vecindad.
The EU does not have a common strategy when it comes to its relationships to Russia and other countries in the region, not even when it comes to its relationships with the Mediterranean Rim. And although it does have common positions and shared positions in the countries, there is no clear will when it comes to establishing a strategy which will be used.
El Tratado de Lisboa da los instrumentos para construir una política exterior. Pero el Tratado de Lisboa en sí mismo no otorga la voluntad de hacer política exterior. Eso depende de los líderes del Consejo Europeo.
The Lisbon strategy gives us the instruments for a foreign policy, but it does not give us the will to put that foreign policy into place. That is something that has to be done by the leaders of the European Council.
Así que, de nuevo, un ejemplo de lo que quiero decir para terminar. La representante para la política exterior europea teóricamente es la ministra de Asuntos Exteriores del conjunto de la Unión. Pero el Servicio Exterior Europeo será coordinado por la representante para la política exterior, más que dirigido. La política de cooperación no será coordinada por el alto representante para la política exterior, y menos aún la política comercial. Por tanto, la Unión Europea, si no corrige eso, seguirá siendo un gigante económico en declive, en decadencia, pero seguirá siendo un enano político en la relación con el mundo.
So I'd just like to give you a little example to bring my first speech to an end. We have the High Representative for Foreign Affairs in the EU, which is the kind of Minister of Foreign Affairs. But this person is the person who coordinates the European Foreign Service. She does not lead it and direct it. And the same goes for cooperation, and in the field of commercial issues, even less so. So the EU really has to change, because if it doesn't do that, it will go from being an economic giant, which is declining, and will become or continue being a political dwarf.
En fin, no queremos que Estados Unidos haga política unilateral y irrazonable, pero no queremos asumir la parte de corresponsabilidad que deberíamos tener para compartirlas con Estados Unidos.
So to sum up, we don't want the US to carry out unilateral politics, but we do not either want to take the responsibility on board of doing things hand in hand with the US.
Hasta ahí.
That's it.
I would like to give the floor next to the Hungarian Foreign Minister. We will discuss the European Action Service certainly later, and the setup and what it means, also following up on what Prime Minister González said. But before the Hungarian Minister, maybe if you could also say a word on Russia. Is it true that EU does not have a strategy towards Russia, and what does it mean?
Thank you very much. As you yourself said a couple of minutes before, this panel is a follow-up of the previous one. So very briefly, before I come to the EU's role and mission and responsibility, I would perhaps make a couple of remarks about the challenges what we are facing based upon the discussion of the previous panel. It's quite clear that there are extremely rapid changes going on now, and there is a deep and accelerating economic, political, geopolitical restructuring. Hence, there is an increasing, that has also been said, unpredictability and uncertainty, and the gap between the global nature of the economy, of the finances, of the trade, of the challenges, of the risks related or unrelated to societal factors is now not narrowing, but widening, between the global nature of all these developments and the fragmented political structure that we now have. Of course, we are all aware of the need that more global governance should be developed, and we all know that this is not possible with the presently existing international organizations, also in view of the fundamental need of rebalancing and restructuring these organizations, be it Security Council or Monetary Fund or the financial institutions or many other international organizations. Now, why did I say that? Because there was an extremely interesting question in the previous panel, in the last part, which was about the possible role of the European Union in narrowing this gap between the global developments and the, as I said, fragmented political structure and the absence of an institutional reaction to these rapid changes. We all know that one of the responses to these changes is exactly the emergence of this kind of semi-formal or informal institutions like G7, G8, G20. Also, we are aware, and this has also been said, of the flaws or deficiencies of these new forums, democratic deficit. Indeed, to my mind, the fundamental deficiency of G20 is not only those what have been referred to, but also the lack of capacity of rule-making. So now let me come back to the EU. I am absolutely convinced, and I keep repeating this obstinately, that EU has a fundamental mission and responsibility as an inspiration for the global governance and global rulemaking as well. So I am slightly in dispute with my Brazilian colleague here. Yes, EU is also an inspiration for other regional integration schemes, but it is also a test laboratory for the global developments. I share some of the arguments which he himself raised. Of course, we have much more in common in Europe than we have on a global level, although, of course, Europe is also a fairly diverse bunch of regions and nations. But all in all, if you look back to the last couple of decades, exactly that has been what was going on. That is, for instance, European Union progressively introduced free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, and with some time later, the same process was going on a global level. Think of the WTO, liberalization of trade in goods first, then in services, and so on. Also, if you take financial regulations, the need for what was triggered, we all know, by the crisis, clearly lots of important things are now going on and happening within the EU, and some of these ideas are already being put, or indeed will be put on a global level in the upcoming years. So Europe is not only an actor, an important actor on the global level, and we all know that this role should be much stronger, and of course this will be and has been discussed whether the conditions are now mature for that, whether the list created all the necessary institutional and legal conditions for that. But all in all, I do believe that if, on the one hand, EU is able to play that kind of major role on the global level, it can also have a very special mission with respect to the global rulemaking. We should never forget that European governance was largely developed, created by European rulemaking. So if we could give more impetus and if we could push for a more efficient global rulemaking, we could perhaps institute the basic conditions for a more efficient and a more up-to-date global governance, which would then be in line with the present conditions, because the present type of governance corresponds to a system which was established roughly 60 or 70 years ago. So, of course, EU, before that, has a fundamental task, and this is, to put it bluntly, to put his own house into order and to create all the internal conditions so that this kind of external role and mission could be played correctly. I do believe that we are now on the right track, despite all the difficulties, all the uncertainties, all the unpredictabilities which we also have within our own house. But we are now working on that very hard, and I do believe that there is an emerging common foreign policy, and if we once manage to establish this EEAS, interesting things will happen. Try to think back to what the role was of the European Commission roughly 60 or more years ago. It was an institution not too many people knew about. It was not very much attractive for the civil servants of that time member states. Only later on, a couple of years later, people realized that this is becoming one of the most important institutions of Europe, indeed, by the time perhaps also on a global level. So if you put together a couple of thousand talented and ambitious people, they'll do something. Now, I do hope for the same thing for the EEAS, European External Action Service, and if we manage to put a common foreign and security policy behind this institutional framework which we are now about to create, I do believe that that will give a significant push for the establishment of a much more efficient role to be played by the EU on the global level. You mentioned one example, of course, this is Russia. I think Russia is a test case. Russia is a test case for the EU. To what extent the EU will be able to establish a common foreign policy. We should never forget that common foreign policy does not mean that we will have a unified or uniform or a common position on each and every international item in all parts of the world. But it does mean that at least on the most important issues, on the most important relations, we do have a common policy, and also we do speak with a common voice. Now, as I said, Russia is the test case. If we manage to develop something in common, be it security policy, be it energy policy, which is of course extremely important, for instance, for my region and for my country, if we manage to develop a common a really common trade and investment policy, if we manage to represent a common competition policy with respect to Russia, all that, of course, would demonstrate that, yes, we do have a common policy. This is a policy of cooperation. This is a policy of strategic partnership. But at the same time, this would also prove and demonstrate that, yes, on the fundamental issues with the most important players of the world, we do have a common policy. I just would like to close it with an additional small remark, and this is that, to my mind, when we speak about relationship in the transatlantic framework, this is just different. This is something in the same family. So I would never identify relationships with the rest of the world and with the United States and Canada, because this is a very special thing. We are interwoven by a fabric of economic, cultural, traditional, political, security, and so on links, and this is of primary importance. And when we really manage to develop a common external and foreign policy, then we should never forget that all that should be done in the framework of the transatlantic link and the transatlantic relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Talking about Russian security, and before I leave the floor to our Canadian guest, President Medvedev made a proposal 2 years ago where he proposed a new security treaty. And it was pretty much the European Union actually that took the lead by saying that security in the 21st century was not so much about hard security, as important as this is, but that there were many other important elements, just as the transnational threats we have been discussing earlier on, human rights, the protracted conflicts out there. And this has actually become the common understanding. So the EU, in a way, is shaping a very important debate there. Is this something that would be perceived like that in Canada?
Well, firstly, just before I answer that question, I want to thank the organizers and Helga, yourself, and everyone that has allowed Canada to participate, and also my Hungarian friend for even mentioning Canada. Because I've participated in a number of international forums, and I guess it's distance in a way, but it's also an attitude that sometimes leaves us out of the dialogue. So I'm extremely pleased to be here. The dialogue is often EU-America. It then went to EU-North America, and we're trying to change the name to South Canada. So I hope that my friend Colin Powell will support me in that venture. But this is an extremely prestigious forum, and it's an opportunity to discuss perhaps a unique perspective, a Canadian perspective, and I'm sure my Chinese colleague will also add to this dialogue. And we come at this obviously with a little different perspective, but one that I think shares the global view, the global concerns that have been outlined firstly by the Slovenian President and Prime Minister, but throughout the next number of days, I think you're going to find that many of the same challenges do exist. And challenges, of course, are a bit like melting polar ice. They don't go in any one predictable direction. And I suppose the recession has added even less predictability into many of the calculations and the equations that we're fulminating over, both in academic circles and in political circles, and certainly in economic circles. So our tradition and our perspective from Canada is informed very much by the traditions of our country, which are deeply, deeply rooted in Europe. And it isn't solely because of the population base that makes up our country, because we are very much a multicultural country and continue to grow and learn and adapt and assimilate in many ways. But it's reflective of a history and a culture that is ongoing and evolving, as is Europe. It's also based on common trade relations. It's based, of course, on our common and enduring interest in things such as global peace and security, which I want to come back to and speak of in terms of the NATO-EU relationship. But perhaps even viewed through the eyes of a country that continues, albeit a new country, relatively new as far as age, and some have said we have more geography than history, but our connections to Europe are very real. You mentioned, Helga, in the beginning, our involvement more recently in the Balkans, Kosovo, and of course, Korea, our current involvement in Afghanistan, but in 2 world wars, where I can very quickly point to 100,000 Canadian citizens who are buried on this continent as testament to our commitment to the very important and overriding issue of security that creates the environment and is the enabler for all of the other important aspects of economic and social and cultural. And so for Canada, NATO is probably the most enduring and more modern institution that allows us to look through that prism as far as how the European-Canadian, European-North American relationship is defined and in fact constructed. And this panel is discussing the potential for a broader EU role in the world and world affairs. Does the EU matter to us? Absolutely. Most certainly. Does Canada matter to the EU? Is the question that I would pose. And I'm also really delighted to hear some of the references to let's not be defined solely by single issues. And even when there is unanimity or almost unanimity within the EU about certain issues that matter to us, there is still very much a one-off relationship that occurs from a Canadian perspective. We still very much deal on certain issues, agricultural issues, for example. I won't go into discussions about seals and how the treatment of seals is the same as cows and pigs. I won't go there. But it does very much matter to Canada. And having just hosted what I believe was a very successful G8 and G20 summit, it matters to us that there is an understanding about the role that we can play and continue to play and want to play, quite frankly, in the transatlantic community. And so, while the past 10 years have very much been a period of significant and rapid change in Europe and in other parts of the world, we have experienced this change as well in a significant way. But coming back to Slovenia, our host for this, and I want to thank my friend, the Slovenian Defense Minister, for the wonderful and gracious hospitality that I've received in the last number of days. But here is a country that was a recipient of NATO assistance, now contributing to a NATO mission. I could say the same of Croatia. But Slovenia is a shining example of a transformation with respect to what can be accomplished through cooperative and collaborative effort. And we're very proud of the partnership that we have with Slovenia, and of course proud of how we operate within bodies like NATO. And while we deployed thousands of soldiers to this region of the world to help bring about peace and stability, and we've been continuing to advocate for a stronger role and continued expansion of NATO, the relationship between the EU and NATO, which is again sort of the bridge to our relationship in many ways with European countries, is one that has to be managed very carefully. And so I wanted to put forward in my introductory remarks the importance of that relationship, because it is far beyond just impacting upon security. Think for a moment about the importance of what is now described as a comprehensive approach, or what we in Canada refer to as the whole-of-government approach, and how we align not just government departments, but align the international coordination that goes into security operations such as Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the preeminent discussion when it comes to how this comprehensive approach would work and should work, and is still evolving. But the importance of not having overlap, not having in any way duplication of effort. And so beyond Afghanistan, we have counter-piracy operations. We have concerns about cyber threat. In addition to this, the economic realities and vitalities of certain countries right now also impact directly on their ability not only to contribute to international security through missions, but also their own vulnerability in the future. And so having a very joined-up approach between the EU and NATO is a critical issue, one that has been receiving a lot of attention, most notably by a panel of experts led by Madeleine Albright, former U.S. Secretary of State. And this, I believe, is going to be critical for how NATO itself evolves and continues to be that that bridge or that forum for discussion for countries that are outside of the EU. So I wanted to make remarks with respect to this. And while Canadian interest in furthering our ties to Europe remain a very strong preoccupation of governments, successive governments in Canada, we also recognize that there are emerging markets and emerging ties in other regions of the world that matter to both Europe and Canada. Brazil was mentioned, China, of course, Russia also. And even though we've been able to dominate Russia in ice hockey, we do have concerns at times about shared borders. And we do have concerns about the ongoing relationship that has to exist between NATO and Russia. And so I come back again to the importance of having dialogue, which I think was a theme that the President touched upon as well, having an informed and sometimes compassionate dialogue about how we reach out to others. But as with extending a rope to someone, it's only as useful. The utility is in people holding on to either end of that rope with equal force in order for a balance in a relationship to exist. So I again would suggest that the European Union must position itself within a strong network of partners. And Canada wants to be, and very much desires to be part of that partnership, and perhaps a little bit more top of mind when it comes to the role that we can play, not just economically, not just from a security contributing nation, but working together to see that with the paucity of resources that exist right now, again, the fiscal challenges that impact on all of our thinking, having efficiencies, transparencies, and having goodwill, and as maybe the Beatles would sing, of love in our hearts when we're dealing with one another in these relationships. And that means whether partnering on military, civilian matters, or geographic divides, comprehensive solutions to international problems and challenges do require very much a goodwill and looking beyond, in some cases, your own comfort level. It will require thinking outside of the traditional relationships and partnerships that perhaps existed in other times in Europe. Europe has modernized, so has the world around it. The countries now that are in the process of being real decision makers and in the execution of policies and operations and certainly future summits around the economy, which will follow, we have to be very conscious of the fact that the world is growing closer, and by virtue of that, we have to make sure that in political and economic and security and defense areas, we continue to be very much engaged in important, informed discussions and formed very much around some of the original ideals that I think all of these countries share, which is human rights, democracy, the protection of human rights remains the potent and dominant force that I think unites the countries in these discussions. And so we very much look forward to being a player in the future, not just through NATO, while it has a fundamental transatlantic character, but we want to be part of the larger dialogue. And to borrow a phrase from the President's speech, using intellectual honesty as the basis for that discussion is extremely important to us. Canada, the United States, European Union working together, I think can have a much stronger strategic effect in a complementary way and make a real difference both for our own countries and for those that we're reaching out to. So thank you very much. I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you. Definitely Canada matters. And if we stay with security for a moment, the EU-NATO relationship you were describing is, of course, one of the key relationships for us if we want to tackle the challenges in the next years. And there is currently actually efforts ongoing between the Secretary General of NATO and Catherine Ashton on the EU side to make this relationship, let's say, more operational despite the non-solved political problems. But what strikes me, what's interesting is that you describe NATO as the bridge when it comes to security. What does this mean, Nikolai Mladenov, for our own efforts in the EU to build up a credible security and defense policy?
Thank you, Helga. Before I answer that question, let me also thank our hosts, the Foreign Minister of Slovenia and my former colleague, the Defense Minister of Slovenia. Both our countries belong to a beautiful part of the world that has perhaps too little geography and too much history. We dream of actually having more of the latter and less of the former. That would have lessened many of our problems. But to very quickly answer your question, before I address the topic of the discussion, I think we need to finally put an end to this debate, soft power versus hard power. Clearly, Europe has a lot of soft power. But clearly, if Europe wants to be relevant on the global stage, it cannot avoid addressing its own issues of security. It doesn't mean undermining the relationship which we have with North America through NATO. On the contrary, I think it will strengthen it. We have a massively broken down and fragmented, actually, defense market in Europe, which creates for lots of inefficiencies. We have a new opportunity, which is now emerging with the Lisbon Treaty, permanent structured cooperation to look at shared capabilities. All of these things we need to address. We have a number of initiatives that came out of the European Commission a couple of years ago, which are very positive, and we need to build on. But addressing that question, finally putting an end to this debate, hard versus soft security, perhaps will help us on the global arena. Going back to the subject of today's discussion, I don't think Europe will automatically become a leader on the global arena for a number of reasons. One is that when Europe was created, the European Union was created, it was created to look inwards, to look at the citizens of Europe and to create free movement of goods, services, etc., which is not what the expectation of the outside world of Europe is. The outside world wants to see Europe with a more active external role, which we're now putting together. But what we need to do in order to remain attractive as a model of development and as political integration is to really face the reality that others in the world outside may not agree with us always, that we might have differences of opinion, that we might have to actually go out and convince them and prove that we bring benefits to the table of discussion. We have three great assets in this, and these are assets that are really quite unique to Europe. First, this is the experience that Europe has in bringing down borders and creating free movement of goods and services and people, of integrating currencies, of creating the Schengen space, of giving up sovereignty to supranational institutions. This is a unique experience. The second asset that we have is that we have a vast multitude of experience in terms of bringing ethnic, religious, regional differences together without undermining national identities or in a way that is quite unique. If you look at it, there's probably everything that anyone can come up on the debate on globally has been done somewhere in Europe, whether it's at a regional level, whether it's at a municipal level or a government level. And last, we have a very strong asset, and that is the soft power of persuasion and diplomacy. And this is because of our own history, because of the millions of people who have died on this continent to allow us today to sit together and resolve our differences in a peaceful way and help others, hopefully, do the same around us. Now, what do we need to do? First, we need to address our own challenge of our own internal cohesion about how we understand the world and how we react to the world around us. The European External Action Service will definitely help in that. I think many of us are sorry, if not all, that it has taken it practically, maybe it will take more than a year to actually set it up. But if you look at it historically, coming up with the euro or creating the internal market. This was not done overnight. And I think what we're now doing is a massive effort that is unprecedented in the history of Europe and in the history of the world. But achieving that internal cohesion is very important. Secondly, we need to look at new issues, and one which I would put on the table, and my Hungarian colleague also did earlier, is energy security. Slovenia is a perfect example of the benefits of actually integrating a country into the European energy market. But unless we solve our own internal energy imbalances that we have in Europe, we will not really be able to look to the outside world and look to our neighbors with the conviction and the belief in equal-footed foreign policy that we really want to have. So looking at energy security and a common European energy policy is very important. Thirdly, and perhaps because I belong to this part of the world that has too much history and too little geography, we shouldn't forget enlargement. Enlargement is vital, and it has been vital to engaging Europe with the outside world. We need to do everything possible to bring all our neighbors between Slovenia and Bulgaria into the European Union once they meet the criteria for membership. And there are two steps in that. We need to constantly reaffirm our commitment. We need to constantly, and I will say this at every meeting I go to, we need to constantly reaffirm our commitment to enlargement in the Balkans, and our neighbors, our friends, need to constantly reconfirm their commitment to reforms and to modernization and to good neighborly relations. These are the key questions that we need to keep up in order to revive the debate. Because otherwise I might sound a little bit dramatic, but soon we will lose the, again, sorry for sounding dramatic, but lose the silent majority of pro-European public opinion in the Balkans and see it dwindle down to a very much silenced minority of people against a rising tide of nationalism and confrontation. The next thing that we need to do is to have a policy that is not just enlargement towards our neighbors. We need to be much more flexible in how we interact with our own neighbors, in how we create opportunities for that interaction, which is different from the full membership and benefit. I spoke earlier about the need to also focus on defense and security issues. And perhaps it almost last on my list, but not in terms of priority, is the transatlantic relationship. Agreeing with everything that was said earlier, let me be very frank about this. Europe, America, Canada are not just partners, we're allies. And it doesn't matter if some countries in the European Union are not members of NATO, we are allies. We may have differences, we may sometimes have different opinions or not agree, but we remain allies. And this is the strength, the fact that we can disagree on things, but move forward and have a constructive, strong and vibrant relationship is the key to our own security and economic opportunity. Last but not least, we need to look to the wider world and create partnerships. Partnerships with countries not just like Brazil or India or China or Russia, but partnerships that focus on a very substantial assessment that we make. And that is, if we identify a certain problem that we need to resolve, assessing what is the core issue that has, what are the core issues that have come together to create a problem that we need to solve, and who is our best partner to actually work in resolving this question. And that sometimes will mean that we will not only talk to allies and partners, and we will have to talk to opponents. It means that we will not only talk to countries that we label as being democratic, sometimes we will talk to other countries as well. But if we want to be constructive, and if we want to be really European, meaning have learned all of our lessons of the past 50, 60 years, we need to be able to talk to everyone in a constructive way and assess what are the real reasons that stand behind the problems that we have in the world around us. Because otherwise, I think it was very aptly said in a book which I recently reread by Richard Kapuscinski, when we face the others, quote unquote, we have three options: either to start a war, to build a wall, or to open dialogue. And I think our strength is in the fact that we've realized and we have internalized the problems that starting a war or building a wall has created in our own history. So dialogue is the key to what we need to in the future. But of course, having that capability, having that capacity, having that strong alliance across the Atlantic, and developing those partnerships that we need. Thank you. That's quick.
Talking about partnerships, I would like to invite our Chinese guest, maybe also to say a word on how China sees the EU, and is China ready to work with the EU on issues other than the traditional areas of cooperation, like on trade and economy, and maybe also for the future, is it G2 or is it G20?
First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Foreign Ministry of Slovenia for its gracious invitation. Given the impact of the international financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis Europe is faced now, with some difficulties in its development, the press in and outside of Europe has made some pessimistic remarks on the future of Europe. But we Chinese are also interested in the development and changes in Europe. Viewing the current EU situation and EU integration from a historical, developmental, and comprehensive perspective, we are still confident and full of expectations of the future of Europe. We expect Europe to turn challenges into opportunities with a stronger resolve to seek development through reform. Reform is inevitable for Europe. This task is challenging, but given the creativity and the wisdom of the European people, we think Europe will be able to keep its advantages and at the same time find or identify a new development direction and accomplish its own strategic transformation. As long as the political leaders meet new challenges with a strategic perspective and a pioneering spirit, we expect European Union integration to continue to move towards a goal of strength in unity. Learning from our own development experiences, we understand that no great accomplishment is smooth sailing and can be completed overnight. As a matter of fact, the EU integration over the past half a century and more was fraught with twists and turns. We expect Europe to play a positive role in international affairs. The EU, as the regional group with the biggest number of developed countries and highest integration level, has considerable influence in global economic and financial sectors. Progress of the world and the settlement of the major international issues calls for active participation of EU. A strong and unified EU can serve as an important force of balance that the world needs, and it can make valuable contribution to world peace, stability, and development. China looks forward to stepping up cooperation and achieving common development with a Europe that treats others as equals. An all-dimensional, wide-ranging, and multi-tiered cooperation structure has already taken shape in China-EU relations. China and Europe, as two important international forces on the international stage, share interest in joint response to global challenges and advancing world peace and development. They have made already unremitting efforts to promote world multipolarity and global governance. EU-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership has already brought the two sides real benefits. We should cherish this partnership all the more, in particular, keeping to the right path of the future development. First, we should develop EU-China relations from a strategic height, a global and long-term perspective, and with a mind to keep pace with the times. Our two sides have much to offer economically, the cultural resources to learn from each other, and huge potential for exchanges and cooperations. Both reform and opening up in China and EU integration are unprecedented, innovative undertakings. We need lend each other understanding and support. Second, since China and Europe are different in social systems, historical background, cultural tradition, and development stage, it is natural that two sides have differences on some issues. What is important is to manage the differences in a correct manner. China stands for resolving disputes through dialogue and cooperation. As long as we uphold mutual respect and trust, have consultations on an equal footing, seek common ground, and while shelving differences, we think China-EU relations will move forward on the normal track. Third, will a fast-growing China bring more opportunities or pose a threat to Europe? This is a vital question that needs a clear answer. Some European media organizations play up fear for China. The negative impact of such doing on China-EU relations should not be overlooked. Indeed, from the perspective from few number of businesses, some goods from China might be competitive, but this is driven by the rules of market economy. The larger picture shows that strong economic growth in China brings more opportunities instead of threat to Europe. This has been proven by ample facts. And I think you come from Germany. If there's not the Chinese market, your automobile industry will be on the ground. Ladies and gentlemen, deepening globalization has made the destinies of all countries more closely associated. No country is able to cope with global issues on its own, nor can any country build its own lasting development and prosperity at expense of failure or loss of interest of other countries. China cannot develop in isolation from Europe and the rest of the world, and nor can Europe and the world develop without China. China would like to work together with European friends to further enhance political mutual trust and practical cooperation. Let's join hands in addressing various global challenges and create a better future for China-EU relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to the audience for the Q&A session, I would like to invite Jean-Dominique Giuliani maybe to say a word about the internal developments. Felipe González has said that the Lisbon Treaty is not a substitute for a lack of political will and leadership, and this is of course very much true. So what is the assessment? What is the Lisbon Treaty? What can the European Action Service do to help us?
Thank you very much. Clearly, Europe has a role to play in the shaping of a new international order. But you're right, it has to fulfill some requirements. Robert Schuman told us from the beginning of the EU, there is no sustainable economical integration without a true political integration. As Prime Minister González said, we just have experienced this with the sovereign debt crisis, which is mainly due to the lack of political integration, the absence of common budgetary and economic policies, which are the only guarantee of the strength and the sustainability of the euro. We have to face it. We did it by strengthening our political integration. And we have to do the same in the international scene without waiting to be obliged to do it again by a drama, like in the Balkans in the 19th, for example. The multipolar world, contrary to what we usually think in Europe, is not a multilateral world. It is a competitive world with many unilateral behaviors of the actors, a world of continent states who continue to act as nation states using the same tool, force, and influence. The European Union, the first GDP in the world, must accept to better define its own interests, to elaborate a strategy on the long run, to defend them without hesitation, to promote them, and to use the traditional tools of the international relation. I do not share the optimism of my good friend Mladenov. We have to revise our exclusive belief in our soft power. It cannot be sufficient in the new world. To become a global player, we have to be not only a global payer, for example. We do not need only a common foreign policy. We need a strong common foreign policy. The EU is too much quite a peace-loving union today. It should not be a non-military power. We do not have the choice if we want to count on the international scene. So, the new European External Service is a good step toward a better promotion of our common interest. But are we sure we share all the constraints that it means? Are we sure we are ready to make all the necessary efforts to fight terrorism, to ensure European security toward all the new threats, cyber security, human and drug trafficking, non-proliferation, low or limited intensity conflicts all around the world? Europe must think itself as a building superpower, a pacific one, but a power under construction. Europe's need a true mobilization in global security matters. And sometimes we seem not to be ready and not to be united toward these new requirements. We have neutral countries. We are very often divided on easy issues and skills. You can be sure this kind of division, for example, those regarding the independence of Kosovo, are a true stab in the back of the common foreign policy and the European Union weight on the international scene. The new EU delegation in the third country should not be only representation offices. They have to be proactive, imaginative, dynamic to promote a stronger Europe and to defend at last our long-term interest. At this point, I just want to mention that, for example, we need to complete the Copenhagen criteria with the obligation to every candidate country to be in line with the common defense and foreign policy. Right now, that is not the case. For example, in the Middle East and toward Iran. Indeed, since the launching of the European Union, we have drifted the course of the European integration. Comfortable with the umbrella of our military alliances, thanks to our American friends, the member states have too long estimated they could have the benefits of the economic integration without a true political union, without a true European defense and the necessary funding that it means to the military to protect and promote their model and their standard of living. The time has come, it cannot be continued. Where are you now? Are we now? Either we decide together to launch new common initiative, internal as external. The first one to me, is to get a new common defense policy, an efficient one. Either some of the member states will decide by their own to take along this responsibility. You can think like me, looking at United Kingdom, France, and so on. It is urgent to make some new progress in the military field, not to use it as a common tool of our foreign policy, but to show our will to prevent any offense against our interests, to take our part of the burden to shape the new world order, and to demonstrate at least our capacity to be united, that means to share our political sovereignties. We need a will. Be sure our prosperity, our security, and our independence depends on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes left for questions. Please, and if you could please identify yourself. And we need a micro.
Thank you. I'm Mike Gapes. I'm a member of the British Parliament. I'm interested in the contrast between what we just heard and what was said earlier, especially in the context of announcements by the German government that they are cutting their military budget, and the British government about to launch a major review of defence and security policy, which will also be in the context of significant defence spending cuts. And no other European Union country, as far as I'm aware, contemplating increases in military spending. Given the technological gap that was referred to, mentioned by Felipe Gonzalez, between and the rapid technological change that's happening with defence equipment, and the vast difference between the United States research on defence matters and that of European countries, is it realistic to be more than a soft power plus European Union? And aren't we forever going to be dependent upon our NATO alliance?
If we have less money, we need to get more value for money. Please.
Well, Helge, the way you've answered the question, I think the trend for declining defense spending is consistent not just of this year, it's been consistent across the board for a number of years now. And there is some sense in that. The problem in Europe is, as you said, the technological gap, but also the fact that our defense equipment market is completely fragmented. And in order for us to achieve efficiencies from that perspective, what we need to do as a first step to developing other powers rather than just soft powers is to integrate that defense equipment market. Now we have a good start with the new directive on defense procurement, despite lots of opposition. We need to look at a number of other questions on the horizon. But we must also go back to the Lisbon Treaty. And the Lisbon Treaty has a number of provisions in it that speak very clearly about solidarity and security that we need to interpret and understand better. But we also need to look at the question of permanent structured cooperation. Now, permanent structured cooperation, I know everyone fears discussing it in Europe, and it is always something that nobody would utter at this level of voice, probably a little bit lower, but it is something that we need to really look at very carefully, because if we are to find efficiencies and if we are to regain the technological gap, we need to look at integrating the market and shared capabilities. And unless we look at shared capabilities, we will remain fragmented. And none of this implies undermining the transatlantic link within NATO. I think, on the contrary, our North American allies within NATO will be rather more than happy to see us have more capabilities than we currently are able to pull together at a European level. And this is what needs to happen, and I think this is the great big next step for Europe. Of course, the first big great step for Europe is to get the European External Action Service in place.
Before I leave the floor to Canada here, indeed, the increased strain on defense budget may have a positive side effect, and this is the need for more resource pooling. As you said, as you explained, joint procurement, the EDA, the European Defence Agency, is very active here, and this could maybe, hopefully, lead to less fragmentation in this market. But Canada.
Thank you. I agree completely with what Nikolai has said, but the question is still very much of to what degree are we going to go through cuts? Canada has actually reversed the trend. We were going through cuts at a time when other defense budgets were growing, and we're growing. We're still growing. We've gone through quite a recapitalization and re-energizing of our military for obvious reasons. As an expeditionary force where we've been involved in peacekeeping for many years, but now doing a full range of uncaveated combat in Afghanistan, we've seen the volatility and the fact that international terrorism, in my view, while it's been curtailed in some regions, is not going away. And the type of warfare that is being waged in Afghanistan today tells us that we are going to continue to rely on the innovation that we have seen in terms of technological advances, the use of UAVs, for example, for surveillance, the joined-up comprehensive approach, international sharing of resources, other types of terrorism that impact greatly on trade. Thinking about piracy in the Gulf of Aden. This type of threat will continue. Cyber threats, which again very much have an economic component to it. So this question of how we maximize effect, interoperability, shared resources, but not tying ourselves to the old way of doing things with fixed installations necessarily that do cost exorbitant amounts of money not only to build but to maintain. We have to be much more agile, in my view, in the future. Great Britain, I believe, for both reasons of necessity but also because of their traditions, their history, they've recognized this. And they are making, albeit difficult decisions, as all countries are. I think the very, very critical timing of the strategic concept debate and the internal review that's happening at NATO is going right to the crux of your question. How do we maximize effect? How do we ensure that any shrinking of military budgets is not going to have a disproportionate effect on not only individual countries' ability to contribute, but the overall package that NATO is able to offer when it comes to global peace and security. So that is the question of our time, to face the challenge of our time around terrorism.
Before I leave the floor to Prime Minister González, I know that János Martonyi has to leave in 5 minutes, so I would like to give him the opportunity maybe to say something to this issue, or no? Fine. Then Prime Minister.
Sí, primero, tenemos 2 millones de soldados en la Unión Europea, pero no disponemos de 100.000 capaces de ser una fuerza de interposición profesionalizada y permanente para desplazarla a cualquier punto. Por tanto, primera cuestión, no presupuestaria. Segunda cuestión, nuestros presupuestos son pequeños pero sobre todo gastamos muy mal los presupuestos. Por tanto, no es un problema de cantidad, es un problema de dispersión de la industria de armamento europea. Tenemos varios modelos de aviones, varios modelos de carros de combate, varios modelos de todo, es decir, tenemos políticas nacionales y no políticas europeas en materia de industria de armamentos. Por tanto, gastamos poco y mal. No propongo que haya más presupuesto, sino que se emplee mejor y sobre todo que tengamos un 5% de los soldados que tenemos disponibles para hacer política exterior y de seguridad.
First of all, I'd like to say that we have 2 million soldiers in the EU, but we don't have 100,000 of those that we can send abroad. So this first problem is not a budgetary issue. Secondly, I'd like to say that although our budget is small, that is one problem, but above all, it's badly spent. We have a huge quantity of different models of planes, of tanks. We have a great dispersion of our investments. So although our budget is small, on top of that, it's being badly spent. National policies which are intervening there more than the European ones. So I'm not saying that we have to have a greater budget, but we have to spend the money better, and that we need at least 5% of those soldiers that can be sent abroad when necessary.
May I add something? We also have to be ready to fight for some cause in the world, and internally in our different states, to be ready toward the public opinion to support a military response, and this is not the case. This is a political question, and Prime Minister is right. It's not only a budgetary question, because as you know, we spend half what the United States spends every year for our defense, and we are the second military power in the world, with 70,000 military soldiers outside serving under the Common and Security Policy flag under the United Nations flag or the nation state flag. So we are the second power. Maybe we have some too much dispersion, but we lack the political will to assume this tool as a pacific tool and to be ready toward our public opinion to assume that we need also a strong military power. Last word about the technology gap. Do not overestimate this technology gap toward the rest of the world. We don't have any problem with our military technology. We have a problem with toward the United States technology. This is our ally.
The fact that so many panelists have taken the floor actually shows that you have touched upon one of the key issues. And I'm glad you raised the issue of public opinion here, because of course there is the lack of interoperability, and the figure Prime Minister González mentioned, the 2 million, always surprises our American friends, because it's actually 500,000 more than they have. But apart from the problems, lack of interoperability, lack of joint procurement, etc., there's really the issue of generating public support for what we're doing. And here we have to say very frankly, we have not done well, not in Brussels, but not also in member states, how actually to convince the citizen in France, in Germany, and elsewhere, that what we do in Chad, what we do in Somalia, what we do in Afghanistan matters for their own security. This is one of the key issues, and when we did the update of the European security strategy 2 years ago, this was the final, very final important point. All 27 heads of states and governments subscribed to it, but there's of course still room for doing more and doing better. Next question, please. Microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Hodge from the British Embassy in Zagreb, but I'm previously chairman of the Civilian Crisis Management Committee in the EU. And my question was really about democracy, and it was interesting that it was actually took us until this stage of the debate that we started to talk about public opinion. I mean, the problem, there seems to be a large amount of consensus about the lack of leadership within the European Union, and European policies tending to adopt the lowest common denominator of common European thinking. And yet, within a union which is a union of democratic states, there is really a rather notable lack of democracy in the way in which we reach these positions. The European Parliament has not been very successful at holding the EU to account and representing that to the voters. Too many member states within the Council use the European Union as a way of avoiding responsibility for the decisions that are taken, at least to their voters, and the Commission itself is not an elected body. So I'd be very interested in hearing the views of the panel on how we might inject more democracy into the decision-making processes of the EU, particularly in foreign policy, and whether you believe that would help us overcome some of these problems of leadership that you've all very clearly identified. Thank you.
Who would like to answer that?
Recogeremos la pelota, porque no se quede vacía. Hay un problema de opinión pública relacionado con el liderazgo. Hay también un problema de opinión publicada. No pública, pero sí publicada. Y hay un problema de democratización institucional. Bueno, pongamos un poco de orden. Es contradictorio pensar en un liderazgo europeo y no presentar en las listas electorales un candidato a presidir la Comisión, que salga del Parlamento. Pero los países siguen decidiendo que no habrá candidato en las listas electorales europeas a presidir la Comisión. Es contradictorio que se le pida un liderazgo a la Unión Europea, cosa que comparto, por tanto, a los representantes de la Unión Europea, pero con frecuencia se les recuerde que son funcionarios nombrados por candidatos electos de los países miembros. Por tanto, que su función es una función delegada. Esto hace difícil que tengamos una democracia representativa eficiente para llegar a los ciudadanos. Por tanto, si se pide más democracia en la Unión Europea, en las estructuras institucionales de la Unión, hay que dar pasos simples. Tiene que haber partidos políticos europeos que presenten listas al Parlamento con candidatos a presidir las instituciones. Estamos dispuestos a dar ese paso. Otra cosa es la opinión pública de verdad. En el esfuerzo de año y medio por elaborar este informe, tenemos algunas sorpresas. Primero, el 76% de los ciudadanos europeos consultados, más allá del grado de europeísmo de su país, están de acuerdo en que la política exterior, representada conjuntamente, digamos por una sola voz, es más eficaz en materia económica, en materia energética, en política exterior y de seguridad, en todas las materias, cosa que niegan siempre los líderes nacionales. Siempre dicen, la opinión pública no toleraría esto por razones de soberanía. Si la opinión pública es la que aparece en los estudios, son los líderes los que no tolerarían eso como cesión de soberanía, nada que ver con los ciudadanos. Por eso hablo de opinión pública o publicada, que no es lo mismo.
Maybe just, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll try to be brief. It says that there's a problem with public opinion. We talk about leadership, but there's also a problem with the published opinion. We're talking about making institutions more democratic, but that's quite contradictory because with the EU leadership, we do not have elections. We cannot choose a candidate directly to chair the European Commission. That candidate does not come from the EU Parliament. There's also contradiction when we ask the EU leadership to be democratic, but we keep telling them that they are officials named by elected candidates in the different member states. So it's difficult for them to actually to show themselves as a representative democracy. That's something that reaches citizens. So if you ask how we can do it, we have to take small, simple steps. We have to ensure that we have candidates that can go directly to the different institutions. And if we take a look at the report which we prepared over the last year and a half, public opinion, contrary to what we generally think, 76% of EU citizens agree that having a single common voice when it comes to foreign policy is far more effective from economic perspective, energy, security, and so on. And that is quite the contrary to what leaders always make us think. They always say, oh, we can't do that because public opinion would be against it. So, however, if the studies we've made show what public opinion actually is, that is the reality. So there is an issue of public opinion and published opinion, as I said at the beginning.
Thank you. I would give the floor first to János Martonyi because he has to leave, and then to Nikolai Mavdenov, and then to Canada.
Thank you very much, Helga, for your understanding. And also I apologize because I really have to leave in a couple of minutes. But the public opinion, I mean the relationship between the public opinion and the European Union institutional system is a vast subject, and I'm afraid we cannot touch upon all the aspects of this. Just one point, if you read the latest results of the Eurobarometer survey, it is disappointing. So we should ask about the reasons. Of course, there are many. I just would like to refer to a single point, and this is that I do believe that in many cases people expect much more from the European Union than it can do or deliver or to perform. That's one way of criticism. That you should have done it, why the European Union does not do it, why the European Union does not intervene and help and brings up solutions and so on. Interestingly, the other type of criticism is just the opposite. Why do they intervene? Why do they interfere with our business? This is none of their business. This is my own business. This is my national government which should decide. So these are conflicting criticism. So there is an underlying fundamental problem of communication here. I fully agree. And the real question is how we can find solutions for this dilemma. And sometimes people believe that this is in fact a state. Sometimes people believe that this is an international organization. It is none of them. It is none of them. And of course, it's very difficult to explain what the méthode communautaire, that is the community method, is, but we have to try, because otherwise it wouldn't work. By the way, and that's my last word, I do believe that the extended powers of the European Parliament will substantially change this situation. It's not yet there, it's coming, but we'll realize in the upcoming months and years that the co-decisive system established as a main rule now by Lisbon will have significant impact upon the daily functioning of the Union, including the political impact of the decisions taken. With that note, Helga, I'm apologizing, I'm sorry. I just would like to express my gratitude and thanks to Semir Zbogar and all the other Slovenian friends for the excellent organizations and the hospitality, and I wish you very successful work. Thank you.
Can I just pick up where Janusz?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe we stay with Europe first and then Canada.
On the point on Parliament, and having served both as a national parliament and European parliamentarian, and now sitting in the Council, I can see different European unions that one would not be aware of if one hadn't sat in the different tables. But the European Parliament could serve that role which Janusz was speaking about, but that role can be further enhanced if there's a stronger link between the European Parliament and national parliaments, rather than just tampering to what the Prime Minister refers to as published opinion. I think this is a very strong link. Of course, that comes at a price, and that means that much more needs to be looked at in the Bundestag than before. But of course, this is a balance which needs to be struck. Secondly, the External Action Service. And there was a bit of a misperception in the media why member states insisted on having stronger member state representation in the External Action Service. It is not because we want to find nice jobs for our diplomats. It's because we want to make sure that our national public opinions can feel that they have ownership over the European foreign policy. Otherwise, that link disintegrates and we will lapse into Brussels versus national capital. Thirdly, and this is where I get a little bit skeptical as far as the openness of decision-making in Europe, how far it can be taken, and this is the debates in the Council. And often it is very popular to say, well, let's have open Council sessions. If you start having open Council sessions, then there's not much of a difference between the UN General Assembly and the Councils of the European Union. We still need to be able to achieve agreement without breaking down the complete decision-making process. And lastly, the panel earlier, somebody in the panel earlier said that you need to look at what's left and right and balance in the middle. Now, that may not always be the case, because if you do that, always support for our troops in Afghanistan will be less than it currently is, and our capacity to act internationally will be much more limited. What we need to do is remember that politicians are there to not just respond to public opinion, but to carry public opinion with them and move it in one direction or the other, and that is the direction of elected government and elected politicians. And I think this is something that we keep forgetting always in these debates, that it is actually politicians not just going after public opinion, but they are the ones that will be forming public opinion. And if they are active in raising support for an external action or for an domestic policy, and if they're successful at that, then they will be successful politicians.
Thank you. Canada.
Just very briefly, and I think this is an excellent question. We could probably have a full panel discussion on this one subject alone in terms of democracy, the media's role in all of this, and communications. I think to pick up on the last point, though, there's no doubt that leading has its risks, and being out in front of an issue that is against public opinion, or that for a myriad of reasons media outlets playing the role of opposition have decided, well, we're going to take another tact, or we're going to decide to put out an alternative version. There is so much information available now. This is one of the challenges that the media face in terms of getting their product, and that's, to be very crass, it's a product. And there are many different media forms, but with blogs, with Twitter. Direct communication now has become a very important tool for not just politicians, for business. And so the media are living in a hyperactive, competitive world as well. Using Afghanistan, again, for a subject matter that is divisive, emotional, complex, difficult in many cases to explain, to parlay directly to public opinion. It does require, I guess, going to the principles of why governments take certain actions, and then explaining it in, I hate to say that, but in the scratch-and-win 7-second world of communications now, you almost need that forum of direct communication, because if it goes through any kind of a sophisticated filter, it's lost. People's lives are so busy that you have less opportunity, perhaps, to make your case than in the past. You also have a new generation, I fear, that are either bombarded by so much information that it's lost in the white noise, or they've tuned out. They're not as engaged for a number of reasons that I think, again, would take a much deeper discussion to get into. But to your question of, is democracy suffering? Looking at the European Union and looking at other models from a Canadian perspective, you have coalition governments. We don't have experience in that regard. But coalition governments are a direct reflection of a very diverse public opinion that then forces political parties to come together. But they're coming together almost butting up against very fundamental different philosophies. I look at the UK government right now and how they're going to reconcile a position on Afghanistan. I look around other European countries that are facing very, very pending, looming debates in their parliaments about the continued commitment to Afghanistan. And we have a minority parliament, which puts us, for different reasons, in the same type of jeopardy to exhibit the type of leadership that Nikolai referred to. So it's a fundamental question on the communications, of direct communications by governments and by leaders. I think that takes a lot of political courage and a lot of perseverance to keep trying to get that direct message out.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have exhausted our time. 7:30 was the maximum I was given, because we would not want to be late for a certainly wonderful dinner that is waiting for us. I would just like ask the panelists if there is anybody who would like to offer a last idea, a last thought, because we will not have time for a full-fledged concluding round. If that is not the case, maybe before I thank you all, the last word from me once again on the Lisbon Treaty, because that has been one of the important issues here. I very much agree with you. The issue of ownership of member states is so important, and it's the ideas that were behind the creation of a European Action Service and of bringing together politics and economics, the Council and the Commission. They came from member states in the first place, already in the Constitutional Convention, because there was a clear lack of efficiency, because in order to ensure better coherence and also continuity. And I would also very much agree with what Mr. Giuliani said. The EU delegations on the ground will be very important, will need to play a very important role in terms of being proactive, but they will have actually the added value of being able to provide continuity, which is something the rotating presidencies could not do. It will be an incremental process. It's far from being perfect, but it's a great opportunity, and I think we will all use it. Thanks very much. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the audience for very good and thought-provoking questions that triggered a full-fledged discussion on the panel. And I wish you all still a wonderful stay in this, against the background of this wonderful scenery in Bled. Thank you very much.